Welcome, dear listeners. If you've ever wondered where all the gossip in a small town goes to rest, it's here, down by the riverbank, tangled in soap bubbles and secrets. The women come early, dragging their baskets, their worries and their wit, scrubbing other people's dirt while laughing about their own. The story that follows belongs mostly to one of them, Clara Merrin, a tired but sharp-tongued mother of 3, who spends her days washing for the wealthy and her nights managing the chaos at home. She and the other washerwomen share more than soap, they share survival, and the kind of humour that keeps despair at arm's length. Laundry by the Riverbank isn't a story about riches or romance. It's about women's work, the noise of friendship, children who talk back, husbands who disappear conveniently, and the small, saving laughter that keeps them all afloat. The river carries their suds away, but not their sorrows. Those linger, glinting in the sunlight like the truth after a good joke. Before we begin, be sure to like, share and subscribe. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket and let's travel together, way, way back together. The river had a way of swallowing secrets. If you leaned close enough to the water's edge, you could almost hear it whisper back every confession it had ever been fed. And goodness, there had been plenty. A dropped wedding ring, a torn love letter, a drowned mouse, and most recently a particularly fine linen sheet that Clara Merrin had pretended not to notice slipping away downstream. It wasn't worth chasing, she told herself. The river had taken greater things from her already. Clara Merrin was born on a fog-heavy morning in March of 1838, when the damp seemed to settle into every crevice of the small stone cottage where her mother laboured. Her father, a cooper by trade and a drinker by preference, had remarked that she arrived looking as cross as a wet hen. Her mother, weary but amused, had smiled and said, "Then she'll fit right in." Clara grew up the second of 5 children in a household that smelled perpetually of sawdust, soap and regret, an intoxicating perfume for any working-class family of that era. She learned early on that laughter came easiest when the roof leaked the worst. By the time she turned 18, Clara had married Thomas Merrin, a blacksmith with strong arms and a fondness for complaining. The first year, she believed the pounding of his hammer on iron was romantic, a man forging their future one spark at a time. By the 5th year, the sound grated like a persistent fly she could never quite swat. Thomas had a gift for making promises disappear faster than wages, but Clara, stubborn as river stones, stayed, mostly because leaving required shoes in better condition than hers. Each morning Clara trudged to the riverbank with her wooden washtub and a bundle of soiled linens. Her children, 3 living, 1 buried, often trailed behind her like a small noisy procession of excuses. The eldest, Peter, was 10 and already perfecting the art of vanishing whenever work appeared. The middle one, Elsie, was 8 and loud enough to make up for the absence of angels. The baby, May, still too young to speak much, had inherited her father's frown, a family heirloom passed down like a curse. Clara loved them all, in that weary, conditional way mothers of her kind often did, fiercely when they were asleep, and less so when they were awake. The other women were already there by the time she arrived, skirts hitched, arms bared, and mouths running faster than their scrub brushes. Laundry by the river was half labour, half theatre. There were tragedies and comedies both, and Clara had learned to play her part. They talked of husbands, of food, of births and deaths, of who had fallen pregnant, again, and who had run off, finally. They gossiped as though their words might bubble the river into laughter. The gossip kept them warm when the wind wouldn't. Some days the river reflected the sky perfectly, soft grey clouds drifting over soft grey lives, and Clara would find herself thinking that if she just kept scrubbing hard enough, maybe she could wash her whole existence clean. Maybe she could bleach away the exhaustion, wring out the disappointments, hang the past on a line, and let the wind carry it off. But the stains always clung. Some were just too deep. The river accepted her efforts silently, slapping against the rocks as if applauding her persistence or mocking it. She couldn't tell which. When the other women weren't looking, Clara would mutter small confessions to the water. Not prayers. She'd given up on those long ago, but half-formed thoughts that felt lighter when released. She told the river about Thomas's drinking, about the rent they were behind on, about the endless stretch of days that looked identical. Once, when the grief for her dead child pressed too heavy on her chest, she even asked the river to take her too. But it had more sense than that, and only sent a cool breeze up her skirts by way of reply. There were stories among the washerwomen, of ghosts who lingered by the reeds, of women who walked too close to the edge and never came back, of laundry that floated for days, following the current like lost souls. Clara never put much stock in them, though sometimes she'd look into the water and swear she saw faces moving beneath, her own, younger and more hopeful, her mother's, smiling with the patience only the dead have, and once her child's, small and translucent as a soap bubble. She blinked, and the image would vanish, leaving behind only her reflection and the constant churning of the current. Still, there was comfort in the ritual. The rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, and beating the fabric became a lullaby of survival. Every slap of wet cloth against stone sounded like defiance. Every swirl of foam felt like a tiny triumph. The women sang sometimes, not proper songs, but hummed refrains stitched together from exhaustion and gossip. Clara's voice was low and cracked, like a door that hadn't been opened in years, but when it joined the others, it didn't sound half bad. As afternoon stretched on, the sunlight thinned into something pale and apologetic. The women packed up their damp burdens, shoulders stooped, hands raw, laughter fading to murmurs. Clara lingered a little longer, her hands resting in the water until they went numb. She liked that feeling, the quiet ache that told her she was still here, still fighting the current, still refusing to let the river take her just yet. When Clara trudged back home with her basket of damp linens, her arms ached in that dull, familiar way that made her feel both strong and endlessly tired. The path from the river wound through a patch of willows, their branches hanging low like judgmental mothers. The air there always smelled faintly of moss and something half-rotten, rather like her marriage. She found that comforting in a way. It was good when the world matched your mood. Her cottage stood at the edge of town, where the dirt road turned to puddles and the chimney smoke never quite rose straight. Inside, everything leaned slightly, including the furniture. Thomas was home before her, as usual, pretending to fix a horseshoe but mostly staring at the fire as though he expected it to apologise for something. "You're late," he grunted without looking up. "The river runs slower when you're not there to scold it," she replied. He snorted, a sound somewhere between laughter and contempt, and went back to his hammer. It was the closest they came to affection these days. Dinner was the usual marvel of economy. Potatoes that had seen better days and onions that had given up entirely. The children sat in varying degrees of complaint. Peter kicked at the table leg, Elsie asked for more of something there wasn't enough of, and Baby May decided that now was an excellent time to discover the joy of screaming. Clara dished out food and discipline with equal weariness. The trick, she had learned, was to season everything with resignation. It gave the stew a surprisingly rich flavour. After dinner, Thomas went to the tavern to talk business, as he always said, which was an inspiring euphemism for drinking away half their savings. Clara didn't stop him. She found the house quieter when he wasn't in it, as though the walls could finally breathe again. The children were easier then too. Peter would stretch out by the fire with a stick and pretend to be a knight. Elsie would hum nonsense songs to the baby. For a moment, Clara could almost imagine a softer version of life, one without shouting or unpaid rent, where laughter came freely and no one smelled perpetually of ale. But imagining things was dangerous. It only made reality look worse. When the children were asleep, she sat by the small window with her mending basket. The night outside was heavy, the kind that pressed against the glass like an uninvited guest. She could hear the river faintly from here, its slow, deliberate rush. It had a sound like breathing, patient, ancient, indifferent. Sometimes she whispered to it again, even from this distance. "Still there?" she'd murmur. "You've got better company than I do." The river never answered, of course, but she liked pretending it listened. It was more responsive than her husband, at least. There had been love once, she supposed. Real love, or something like it. When she was younger, she used to believe that love could outlast hardship, that if you held on tight enough, everything else would eventually fall into place. But the years had worn that notion thin, threadbare as her old shawl. Love, she'd learned, was like laundry. No matter how hard you scrub it, it never stays clean for long. Her mother had warned her. "Don't marry a man for his arms," she'd said. They'll lift you once and drop you for the bottle. Her mother had been a woman of astonishing accuracy and astonishing bad luck, having married 2 such men in her lifetime. When Clara buried her, she'd whispered, "You were right," though she doubted her mother would have taken much comfort in that. Money was tight, of course. It always was. Clara took in extra washing from the wealthier homes in town, a doctor's wife, a shopkeeper's daughter, even the vicar's mistress, who paid in silence and secrecy. The fine fabrics felt strange in her hands, soft and weightless, like a world she would never belong to. Sometimes she imagined wearing them, just to see what it felt like to be someone who could afford gentleness. But she never did. It would only make returning to her coarse linens that much harder. Once, on a rare morning when Thomas was sober and almost kind, he'd told her she worked too much. "You'll wash yourself away one day," he'd said, half joking. She'd smiled and said, "Then I'll be the cleanest ghost in town." He hadn't laughed, but the river might have. The river, she suspected, understood dark humour better than any living soul. When the rent collector came that month, Clara met him at the door with a polite smile and a basket of clean shirts. "If you take one," she told him sweetly, "at least you'll look presentable while you're robbing me." He'd coughed and said something about policy before hurrying off. The next week the landlord sent his wife instead, a woman with sharp perfume and sharper eyes. Clara scrubbed an extra hour that day, muttering curses that even the river would have blushed to hear. At night, when the wind rose and rattled the shutters, Clara dreamed of the riverbank. In her dreams, it wasn't just water that flowed. It was time itself, carrying away the years like driftwood. She saw herself younger, her children smaller, her husband sober and smiling. Then she saw the river swell, dark and wide, and all of it, the cottage, the laughter, even her weary reflection, was swept away. She always woke before it reached her. She wasn't sure if that was mercy or punishment. The next morning the mist clung to the river like a secret it wasn't ready to tell. The washerwomen appeared one by one, emerging from the fog with their baskets and complaints, as reliable as church bells and twice as loud. Clara arrived last as usual, her shawl drawn tight and her eyes already set in that resigned squint women wear when they know exactly how their day will go. "Morning, Clara," called Bess Harper, a woman with arms like tree trunks and gossip sharp enough to cut glass. "You're late. Overslept, or just pretending you've got dreams left?" Clara dropped her tub onto the bank with a thud. "Neither," she said, just waiting for the enthusiasm to kick in. "It's running later than usual." The women laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter was cheaper than despair. They set to work, sleeves rolled, knuckles whitening in the cold. The river gurgled with the kind of amusement only nature could afford. Their hands moved in rhythm, scrub, rinse, beat, ring, like an orchestra of misery, and Clara found herself humming again that same tuneless melody that rose when silence became unbearable. The gossip began quickly, as it always did. Mrs. Pritchard's husband had been seen walking too close to the mill girl. The baker's new apprentice had left town under mysterious circumstances, involving a goat and a missing wedding ring. Someone whispered that a widow downriver had found a piece of lace belonging to a drowned girl. Or maybe it was a drowned lace belonging to a missing girl. No one could quite agree, and no one wanted to. Gossip was better when it didn't make sense. Bess leaned close to Clara and said, "You hear the vicar's wife's expecting again?" "At her age," Clara snorted. "Well, faith clearly works in mysterious ways. I've prayed for a full purse for years and got another child instead." Even the river seemed to laugh that time, sending up a small splash against the rocks. As the morning wore on, the women's talk shifted from scandal to survival. Whose rent was due, who'd pawned what, who'd been refused credit at the grocer's. One woman bragged she'd managed to stretch a loaf of bread for 3 days. Another confessed she'd watered down the milk so thin her cat refused to drink it. There was a bleak kind of camaraderie in it all, like passengers comparing notes on a sinking ship. Between loads, Clara stretched her back and gazed at the water. The surface rippled with the reflections of trees and clouds, soft and deceptive. It looked almost peaceful, but she knew its temperament too well. The river was like life, calm until it wasn't. She sometimes imagined just walking straight into it, letting it swallow her aches and obligations whole. But then she'd think of her children's faces, tired, hungry, and irritatingly hopeful, and decide the river had swallowed enough Merrins already. When noon came, The women unwrapped their meagre lunches. Bread gone dry, a bit of cheese if fortune allowed. Clara bit into hers without ceremony. "You ever think," she asked between chews, "that the river knows us better than anyone? Sees us on our worst days, hears things we wouldn't tell the Lord himself?" Bess smirked. "If the river's got ears, it's deaf by now. You should hear what Alice here said about her landlord last week." Alice, a soft-spoken widow with eyes that looked perpetually 2 seconds from tears, blushed. "It wasn't that bad," she said. "Oh, it was poetry," Bess replied. "Rhymed and everything. I'd have written it down if my hands weren't full of suds." Clara laughed until she coughed, that deep, rasping kind of laugh that sounded almost alive. But the laughter faded when the wind changed. The smell of decay drifted from downriver, something foul and faintly familiar. The women all turned to look. The water moved slower there, darker, carrying bits of debris tangled in weeds. "Probably another sheep," one of them said. "Or a drunk from the tavern," another offered. Clara didn't say anything. She just watched the ripples spread, widening and fading, until all that was left was the ordinary hush of moving water. Still, she couldn't help thinking, the river took things quietly without fuss, and maybe that was the best kind of mercy there was. The day dragged on until their arms throbbed and their laughter dulled into mutters. The sun tried to push through the mist but gave up halfway, as though even it was too tired for this place. Clara packed up her laundry, now cleaner than her conscience, and turned for home. Bess called after her. "Same time tomorrow," Clara smiled faintly. "If the river doesn't take me first." It wasn't a joke exactly, but the women laughed anyway. They always did. That was how you kept living. One dark laugh at a time. Back home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Thomas hadn't returned yet, and the children were scattered like laundry themselves. One asleep by the fire, one on the floor with a broken toy, one drooling in a cradle that had seen better years. Clara stood there for a long while, basket still in her hands, listening to the creaks of the floorboards and the faint echo of the river beyond the hills. Life, she thought, was just a long series of things to wash and people to forgive. That evening the cottage was lit by a single oil lamp that burned as reluctantly as its owner. Clara sat mending a torn shirt while the children dozed in uneven patches of sleep. Thomas still hadn't come home. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she noticed. The silence without him wasn't peace tonight. It was something sharper, like the stillness before a storm that didn't have the decency to start. The shirt in her lap belonged to him, the sleeve torn, the cuff frayed. She stitched it carefully anyway. Habit, not affection, guided her hand. There was a certain poetry to it, mending what would only be ruined again. Marriage, she thought, was just another kind of laundry. You scrub and patch and sigh, and still it smells faintly of disappointment. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters like a beggar looking for warmth. The river's murmur drifted faintly through the night, the same slow whisper that had followed her all her life. Sometimes she imagined it calling her name, not cruelly, but with that strange tenderness that only loneliness can manage. "Clara," it seemed to say, "come rest, come quiet, come clean." She shook her head, pricking her finger on the needle. "Not tonight," she muttered to the darkness. "I've too much left to complain about." It was nearly midnight when she heard the door creak open. Thomas stumbled in, smelling of ale and excuses. "You're still awake," he slurred. "Only technically," she said. He tossed his coat over a chair and missed. "Had a long day," he added. "So did I," she said, "but mine was productive." He glared at her, but it was a soft, drunken glare, the kind that loses its balance halfway through. "You think you're funny, Clara?" "No," she said, "just accurate." He muttered something under his breath and collapsed onto the bed, boots and all. The bed groaned in protest, much like Clara did. She turned back to her sewing, though her eyes weren't on the thread anymore. Her gaze drifted to the window, where moonlight spilled across the floor in a pale, watery stripe. It looked like the river had crept inside while no one was watching. When she finally lay down, sleep came grudgingly. Her dreams were thick and restless, the kind that feel more like memories wearing new clothes. She saw herself standing in the river again, water swirling around her knees, the current tugging at her skirt. In her hands were linens that never came clean, no matter how she scrubbed. The faces of the other women flickered in the mist. Bess, Alice, and the rest, all silent now, their mouths open but soundless. and then beneath the surface she saw movement. Something white drifting just below the waterline. It might have been a dress. It might have been herself. She woke with a start. The lamp had gone out, the air thick and cold. The river's sound was louder now, impossibly loud, as if it had moved closer in the night. For a moment she thought she could hear it inside the walls, whispering like wet fabric wrung out by invisible hands. Then she realized it wasn't the river. It was Thomas, snoring. The disappointment was profound. By dawn she was already up, heating the kettle over what passed for a fire. Her hands shook as she poured the water into the basin. Maybe it was from the chill, or maybe it was something else entirely. The morning light slid through the window, pale and indifferent, and she caught her reflection in the basin, older, heavier, and somehow less real. She wondered when she'd started looking like her mother. It must have happened quietly, like everything else. When she reached the riverbank later that morning, the others were gathered in a tight huddle. Their voices were low, urgent, the kind of tone that made even the birds stop listening. Clara set down her basket and walked over. "What's wrong?" she asked. Bess turned to her, face pale under the grime. Something floated down just after sunrise. Clara's stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" "A someone," Bess said, her voice cracking. "They think it's old Mrs. Green from the Mill Cottages. Slipped, maybe, or decided she'd had enough of slipping." The group fell into silence. The river burbled on, unbothered. Its waters looked thicker today, a strange brownish shimmer under the morning sun. Clara stared at the spot where the current bent around the rocks. It didn't surprise her. Not really. The river took what it wanted, and it never took without reason. After a while, one of the women muttered, "She was kind, always shared her soap." "Always lent her gossip too," said another. "I'll miss that." Bess crossed herself and whispered, "God rest her soul." Clara dipped her hands into the water and said, "She's probably the cleanest she's ever been." The women gasped, then giggled despite themselves. The sound rose like a strange hymn, carried away by the wind. They went back to work after that, because what else was there to do? Death, after all, didn't stop laundry. It only changed what needed washing. All that day, the image of the drowned woman stayed with Clara, clinging to her thoughts like wet linen. She couldn't quite decide whether she pitied Mrs. Green or envied her. There was something efficient about the woman's exit, simple, silent, and free of all the back-talk life demanded. No neighbours to judge, no bills to haggle over, no husband to trip over on the way to despair, just a final, decisive slip into quiet. Clara found it almost elegant. When she mentioned as much, Bess swatted her shoulder with a soggy rag. "Don't talk like that, Clara Merrin. You'll bring bad luck." "Bad luck?" Clara smirked. "What do you call this, then?" "Good fortune with a side of mildew." Bess tried to glare, but laughter betrayed her. "You're wicked." "Only when I've had sleep," Clara said. "Otherwise I'm just realistic." As she bent over her work again, the river gurgled around her knees. The water felt colder today, sharper somehow, as if it knew it had done something worth gossiping about. She imagined Mrs. Green's spirit floating along somewhere beneath, tutting at the state of everyone's hems. Maybe she'd find peace there, or maybe she was still scrubbing her own soul clean on the other side. Heaven or not, Clara suspected it still required laundry. That evening, after the washing was done and the women had drifted off one by one, Clara lingered by the riverbank alone. The mist rolled in, pale and shapeless, and the world narrowed to the sound of running water and her own slow breath. The surface rippled faintly, catching bits of light from a sinking sun. She crouched and trailed her fingers in it, watching the small circles widen and vanish. "You didn't have to go alone, you know," she murmured to the water. "We'd have kept you company, same as always. Just would have needed time to finish this week's shirts first." The river didn't answer, but a bubble rose and burst as though it had considered the offer. She smiled faintly. I know," she said. "No one escapes the washing till it's done." By the time she got home, the sky had turned the colour of a bruise. The cottage felt heavier than usual, not just quiet, but still, like it was holding its breath. Thomas was asleep again, sprawled half-dressed on the bed. There was an empty mug on the floor, a trail of dried ale on the table, and that faint, familiar smell of hopelessness hovering in the air. She moved around him like a ghost, gathering the day's rags, folding what could still pass for clean. The sound of the river reached her faintly through the window, steady, tireless. It had a rhythm now that matched her own heartbeat. She thought of Mrs. Green again, drifting downstream, finally free of dishes and debt. Clara couldn't help thinking that maybe the woman hadn't drowned at all. Maybe she'd simply gone home, wherever that was. The next morning the river was strangely low, its surface calm and clear as glass. The women whispered that it meant a storm was coming. Clara wasn't so sure. She thought perhaps the river tired itself out after swallowing someone's sorrows whole. Even rivers, she reasoned, must need a rest. When she reached her washing spot, something pale caught her eye, tangled in the reeds near the rocks. For a terrible moment she thought it was Mrs. Green again, come back to haunt them. But as she drew closer, she saw it was only a piece of fabric. Soft, fine linen, embroidered with initials she didn't recognize. Not one of theirs, certainly. Too delicate for their kind. She lifted it out carefully, wringing the water from its folds. It smelled faintly of lavender and river silt. Someone rich had lost this, she thought. Someone who'd never stood ankle-deep in cold mud and called it work. She tucked it into her basket, meaning to return it later, but found she couldn't. All afternoon she kept glancing at the cloth, its pale shimmer against the rough cotton and grey wool. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. She could never have something like that, not without spoiling it. Still, she carried it home. That night, when the others slept, she took it out again. The candlelight made it glow, soft and ghostly, and for a brief, wild moment she imagined draping it over herself. A shroud or a gown, she couldn't tell which. She pressed it to her cheek. It was cool, smooth, impossibly clean. The thought came to her then, uninvited but oddly polite. Maybe this is what peace feels like. Then the baby stirred, crying softly, and the spell broke. Clara folded the cloth back into her basket and sat staring at the shadows. The river's murmur came through the window again, steady and knowing, as if reminding her that nothing stays clean for long. The night refused to settle. Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of a house that didn't quite rest. The soft wheeze of Thomas's snore, the ticking of the wall clock that always lost time, the baby's occasional sigh like a tiny ghost remembering something. But beneath all of that, faint and steady, she could hear the river. It was never silent, not even in the blackest hours. It whispered and shifted, always busy, always certain of its direction. She envied that about it, the confidence of water. People wandered, water never did. Her mind, stubborn as her body, wouldn't stay still. She kept seeing the linen in her head, that pale shimmer, almost glowing in the dark. There was something unnatural about it, too clean to belong to anyone in her world. It had survived the river unspoiled, while she herself couldn't make it through a single day without a stain. Perhaps that was what fascinated her. She wondered whose initials had been stitched into it, the delicate thread forming letters that seemed too fine to be handled by mortal hands. Maybe the woman had been wealthy, or maybe, and this amused her darkly, she'd been another washerwoman who just had better taste. Clara got up, quietly so as not to wake the children, and lit the lamp. The cloth sat folded in the basket near the door, almost expectant. She pulled it out, smoothing the fabric against her lap. The stitches caught the light, faint gold, faded in places but still proud of their elegance. Whoever it had belonged to, she decided, hadn't deserved it. People who owned things this fine rarely did. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It felt lighter than air, absurdly soft as though the river itself had woven it from fog. She caught her reflection in the window pane, herself draped in something that made her look like a woman from another world. For a moment she didn't look tired or worn down. She looked like someone who could be mistaken for happy. She laughed quietly. "Well, that's unsettling," she said to the glass. Then she saw it, a flicker in the reflection, movement outside near the riverbank. Probably moonlight, she thought, or her imagination performing small cruelties again. But the thought took root, stubborn and growing. She set the lamp down and stepped outside, shawls or shroud still over her shoulders. The night was cold enough to make the air taste metallic. The moon hung low, swollen and indifferent. The river gleamed faintly under its light, moving in its slow, endless way. Clara walked barefoot through the damp grass, wincing at the chill but drawn forward all the same. The path down to the water was familiar. She could have found it blindfolded. In fact, she nearly had, once or twice, after evenings of exhaustion so deep she'd almost sleepwalked her way to the river's edge. She stopped where the bank dipped low, the spot where she always washed the heavier linens. The current there was slower, but deeper. The water looked black, like spilled ink. She stood staring at it for a long time. The linen around her shoulders fluttered slightly in the wind. "You've got a habit of keeping what isn't yours," she told the river softly. "Sheets, rings, women. I suppose that's your talent." The river didn't answer, of course, but it moved differently. A shift, a small pull at the edge of her skirt. She smiled faintly. "You think I'd make a good addition, do you? Someone to help with the gossip?" Her tone was light, but her voice wavered. The dark humour had always been her armour, and now it felt thin. She crouched, dipped her hand in the water. It was colder than she expected. Sharp, biting, alive. The current wrapped around her wrist like a pulse. "You're always moving," she whispered. "Never waiting." Maybe that's what freedom feels like. A twig cracked behind her, and she turned sharply. But it was only the wind tossing branches and memories. She straightened, wrapping the cloth tighter around herself. "Not tonight," she said again. "You've got enough women in there." Then, almost apologetically, "Besides, someone's got to finish tomorrow's washing." The river seemed to sigh, or maybe that was her own breath leaving her. Either way, it felt like a conversation. She walked back toward the cottage, her bare feet numb, her heart strangely light. The linen clung to her, damp with mist, but she didn't take it off. When she lay back down beside Thomas, the scent of river water lingered on her skin. He stirred and muttered something incoherent, and she smiled in the dark. "Go back to sleep," she whispered. "You'd never believe what the river said about you." The next morning arrived in a thin grey drizzle, the kind that couldn't decide whether to rain or just sulk. Clara woke before the others, though she didn't remember falling asleep. The fire had gone cold, the air inside the cottage smelled faintly of damp stone and dreams, and the linen, that strange pale thing, was still wrapped around her shoulders. It looked too clean for this world, still glowing faintly even in the dull light. She might have imagined that, of course, but imagination was all she had left that didn't require scrubbing. Thomas stirred on the bed, one eye half open. "You're up early," he mumbled. "I haven't been to sleep," she said simply. He groaned, rolled over. "That explains the mood." "Does it?" she asked quietly. "I thought that was you." He grunted, the sort of sound that meant both defeat and breakfast. Clara moved through her morning tasks with an odd lightness, as if her bones had been quietly replaced with hollow reeds. She swept, fed the fire, dressed the children, all with a peculiar detachment, like watching someone else perform her life from a few steps away. When she caught her reflection in the kettle, she paused. Her skin looked paler than usual, her eyes sharper. Not tired, just riverish, if such a word could exist. Like something that had been rinsed of its colour but not its intent. The walk to the river felt shorter that morning, though her basket weighed the same. The mist clung to her skirt hem, whispering up little secrets of moisture. The air smelled of moss and cold iron. When she reached the bank, the other women were already gathered, but when they saw her, their chatter faltered. Bess, ever the first to notice a change, squinted. "You look different, Clara. Rested somehow. That can't be right." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe the river's started doing my washing for me." Bess laughed, but it came out uneasy. "Don't joke like that after yesterday. Poor Mrs. Green." "Yes," Clara said, dipping her hands into the water. "Poor Mrs. Green. She's free of chores now, probably telling St. Peter how we rinsed the linens wrong." The others tittered nervously, but Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the current. It shimmered strangely today. Slower, darker, almost deliberate. The water lapped against her wrists as though greeting her. She didn't pull away. It wasn't cold anymore, not to her. It felt almost warm, almost kind. As the morning wore on, small things began to unsettle the group. Clara hummed softly while she worked, a tune no one recognised, low and winding, with no beginning or end. The other women exchanged glances but said nothing. They couldn't quite name what had changed, only that the air felt different around her, like a calm before a kind of weather they didn't have a word for. At one point, Bess leaned over and whispered, "You sure you're all right? You seem far away." Clara smiled without looking up. "I'm closer than you think." That should have sounded like comfort, but it didn't. The day stretched long. The women packed up early, muttering about the rain and their aching backs. Clara stayed behind, alone again with the water. The river looked the same as it always had, yet it no longer felt like something outside her life. It felt like part of it, the way breathing was. She crouched low, letting her hands drift through the current. "You're patient," she whispered. "That's what I like about you. You wait for everything to come back." Something small floated past, a scrap of cloth grey and frayed. She plucked it from the water and wrung it out. It wasn't Mrs. Green's linen, nor her own, but something older. The threads dissolved under her touch, melting into her palms like foam. She watched them fade, then wiped her hands dry on her apron. When she returned home that evening, Thomas barely noticed her. He was in one of his darker moods, muttering about debts and luck and other things that sounded the same after a while. She listened, but distantly, as if his voice came from somewhere deep underwater. When he snapped, "Are you even hearing me, woman?" She looked at him, smiled thinly and said, "Perfectly. It's just not very interesting." He blinked, caught between anger and confusion. "You've changed," he said finally. "I know," she replied. "The river said so." He frowned. "You've gone mad." "Maybe," she said, walking past him to hang her shawl, and the pale linen still impossibly white, by the fire. "But madness is quieter than marriage. I'll take it." That night she slept dreamlessly. Or maybe she didn't sleep at all. Over the next few days the rain came and went like a fussy guest. Never enough to flood the river, just enough to keep everything smelling faintly of damp earth and wet wool. The washerwomen grumbled about it, of course. They grumbled about everything. Aching backs, stingy grocers, husbands who couldn't find work but could find the tavern blindfolded. But now, woven through the usual complaints, was something new. The way they lowered their voices when Clara's name came up. "She's different lately," whispered Alice, wringing out a sheet so fiercely it looked personal. "Not unhappy, not exactly, just not here." Bess, who was never shy about other people's business, said, "Maybe she's seeing someone." "There's that miller by the bridge," Alice frowned. "She's married." "So's he," Bess said with a shrug. That never stopped anyone worth gossiping about. But deep down, even Bess didn't believe it. There was something else about Clara now, something the human explanations didn't quite cover. The others could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The way the air seemed to hush when she arrived, the way the water stilled around her hands. It was as if the river itself had grown courteous. Clara didn't seem to notice their unease. She came and went quietly, humming that strange tune no one recognized. Her humour hadn't vanished. It had simply softened into something thinner, finer, as though the laughter now floated just beneath the surface. When Bess teased her about her pale complexion, she'd smile faintly and say, "I'm just letting the river do my washing inside and out." That earned nervous laughter, but no one pressed further. On the fourth day, when the clouds broke and sunlight spilled across the river like a rare apology, Clara took off her shoes and waded in up to her knees. The others gasped. "Are you daft?" Bess hissed. "You'll catch your death." Clara smiled. "If that's all it takes, then death's more efficient than I thought." The water rippled gently around her, almost playful, tugging at her skirt as if greeting an old friend. She looked down and said, "You missed me, didn't you?" And though the women couldn't hear any reply, Clara nodded as though something unseen had agreed. When she stepped out, her skirts were dry. Not damp, not clinging. Dry. That unsettled them more than anything she'd said. Bess swore it must have been the wind. Alice muttered something about witchery, but Clara simply wrung her hands, calm as a prayer, and said, "It's only water. It knows who to trouble." Word began to travel through the village in that subtle way fear always does, from whispers at the bakery to murmurs at the churchyard gate. Some said she'd been seen walking along the river late at night, her white shawl shining like a ghost's hem. Others swore the water near her washing stone had turned clear even in rain, as though it refused to muddy around her. The vicar's wife even suggested she might be under some influence, which in that town was code for interesting enough to worry about. Clara heard all of it eventually. She didn't deny the stories, but she didn't confirm them either. "If the river's haunting me," she said once, "it's the politest haunting I've ever had." Thomas grew quieter too, though not out of respect. He watched her warily, as though she'd become something he couldn't shout into submission. She went about her work with the same calm, but there was something in her eyes that unnerved him, a serenity he couldn't ruin. One evening, after too many ales, he tried anyway. "You think you're better than the rest of us now?" he spat, blocking the doorway. "No," she said, "just cleaner." He raised his hand, then thought better of it. Something in her stillness made him hesitate, that same unnatural calm that cows have before lightning strikes. She stepped past him as if he were made of fog. "Don't wait up," she said. "The river doesn't like to be kept waiting." He didn't sleep that night, though she did not come home until dawn. When she returned, her hair was damp, her eyes brighter. "Where were you?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Talking," she said. "To who?" She looked toward the river and smiled. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And she was right. He wouldn't have. That day at the riverbank, when the others arrived, Clara was already there. Her basket was empty, her sleeves rolled, her feet bare in the water. The current rippled gently around her, whispering its endless gossip. She turned to them, smiling, and said, "It's warm today." "The river's in a good mood." Bess shivered despite the sun. "You should be careful, Clara. It remembers the ones it's taken." Clara dipped her hand into the current, letting it glide between her fingers. "So do I," she said softly. "That's why it keeps me." The women exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or cross themselves. The river went on murmuring, as if amused, and for a moment, when the light struck the water just right, they could swear it shimmered white. The same white as the linen Clara still kept folded beneath her arm. The following week began with a stillness that made the whole valley uneasy. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. The river moved more slowly, like it was listening. The washerwomen noticed first, not the silence itself, but the way sound carried through it. When they laughed, it echoed oddly, as though someone under the surface were laughing back. Clara, of course, didn't mind. She'd taken to speaking softly while she worked, muttering small comments that made no sense to the others. "Good current today," she'd say, nodding at the water. Or, "That's right, take it with you. I never liked that stain anyway." If anyone asked who she was talking to, she'd smile and reply, "Someone with better manners than most men I've met." The others started washing a little farther upstream. Bess claimed it was for the light. Alice said it was for her back. But everyone knew it was because Clara's patch of water felt claimed. The foam that drifted from it was unusually white, like whipped clouds, and the smell, not sour river smell, but faint lavender, as though the water had learned her scent. Thomas grew quieter as the days passed. He still came home late, still blamed the world for being what it was, but he watched Clara differently now, like a man who'd lost the map of his own home. Once, when she hummed that low winding tune, he said, "You sound like the river itself." She looked up from her mending and said, "Maybe it sounds like me." He didn't argue. He just went outside and didn't return until morning. One Sunday, when the rest of the town filed into church, Clara stayed by the river. The vicar's wife spotted her from the path, bare-armed, skirts hitched, water curling around her ankles. The woman gasped as if she'd seen a heresy made flesh. Later, over tea, she whispered that Clara Merrin was too close to unearthly things. By Monday, that sentence had multiplied into 3 versions, all worse than the original. Clara heard the rumours and laughed. "If holiness means keeping your hands clean, then I'll stick with my sins," she told Bess. "At least mine smell like soap." That afternoon, she noticed something curious. When she dropped a shirt into the river, the current slowed, ever so slightly, until she lifted it out again. The water obeyed her hands as if waiting for permission to move. She tested it twice more, same result. "Well," she murmured, "you're a polite thing, aren't you?" And the water obligingly made a small swirling bow around her wrist. She didn't tell the others. Why would she? People ruined magic the way they ruined everything, by naming it, claiming it, turning it into something ordinary. The days blurred together after that. Laundry, children, Thomas, river, all part of the same rhythm, like the beating of a single slow heart. But sometimes, when she passed her reflection in the basin or window, she noticed something faintly altered. The light on her skin shimmered like ripples. Her eyes had taken on the grey-green shade of deep water before rain. She didn't mind, it suited her. At night she still heard the river's voice through the walls, a low, steady murmur. She never made out words, just the tone. Calm, patient, amused. It wasn't frightening. It was the sound of something vast that expected nothing from her, which was a kind of love she'd never known. When the other washerwomen spoke of her now, they did so softly, as if afraid the water might overhear. They still worked by the river, of course. People can get used to anything, even enchantment, but none of them lingered after she left. They said the current changed when she walked away, the ripples smoothing as though it missed her. And maybe it did. Clara never claimed to understand it. She only knew that life felt lighter now, her days rinsed of the heaviness that used to cling. She still joked, still gossiped, still scolded her children, but there was something behind her smile. The peace of a woman who'd finally found a listener she didn't have to impress. By the end of that summer, everyone in town had an opinion about Clara Merrin, though most of them were built from second-hand sightings and imagination. The baker's wife swore she'd seen Clara stand in the river up to her waist, unmoving for an hour, like she were waiting for a sermon that never came. The cooper said the water around her feet didn't make ripples, which made no sense but sounded just believable enough to repeat. The vicar's wife, whose voice carried better than any bell, announced that something unchristian was at work and began locking her shutters on fine evenings. Clara found the attention inconvenient only because it made the price of soap rise. "Folk always charge extra once you're interesting," she said to Bess one morning. Bess, still loyal but wary, gave a weak smile. "Maybe try being dull again. Dull's cheaper." "I was dull for 20 years, Clara replied. "Didn't make me rich, just tired." Even Thomas had changed. He wasn't cruel now, just puzzled, as if he'd misplaced a wife and come home to find someone similar but upgraded. He watched her the way a dog watches a mirror, waiting for the reflection to blink first. When he finally asked, "What do you do down there all day?" she said, "The same as you do at the forge. Listen for things that want shaping." He didn't ask again. The children, though, adored her new calm. She told them stories about the river as if it were a friend, how it carried gossip from town to town, how it sometimes hid fish just to tease the fishermen, how it remembered every secret ever whispered to it and kept them all better than a priest. "If you're kind to it," she told them, "it keeps your mistakes moving so they don't stick." Peter called it nonsense. Elsie said it sounded like grace. Both were right. At the river, the women had stopped asking her questions. They still worked beside her, but conversation broke around her like water around a rock. When she spoke, it was softly, and the current seemed to echo her. Once, when Bess dropped a rag into the flow, it snagged on a branch, then drifted back upstream, an impossible thing. Bess crossed herself. Clara just smiled. "Told you," she said. "It knows who to trouble." Word reached the landlord eventually, who hinted to Thomas that his wife was drawing the wrong sort of attention. Thomas only nodded. The truth was, attention or not, the cottage had never been cleaner, the children healthier, and for reasons he couldn't explain, the fire in his forge burned steadier when Clara hummed nearby. He still didn't believe in magic, but he'd stopped believing entirely in coincidence. Autumn crept in, quiet as a rumour that had outlived its scandal. The leaves browned, the river cooled, and the town slowly accepted what it could not understand. Clara Merrin kept washing, kept humming, kept living, perhaps a little apart but no longer burdened. People stopped watching her so closely. Mysteries, after all, are exhausting when they refuse to misbehave. Sometimes in the evenings she would stand by the bank with her youngest on her hip, watching the twilight gather in folds across the water. "Listen," she'd whisper. "Hear that?" The child would nod, though there was only the sound of the current slipping over stones. "That's the river remembering," she'd say. "It never forgets the women who trusted it." And with that she'd turn for home, skirts brushing the grass, the faint scent of lavender following her. Clean, ordinary, and just a little impossible. The chill came early that year. The first frost dusted the grass by the river like flour on a work table, and the washerwomen came wrapped in every shawl they owned, layered so thick they could barely bend. Their breath rose in little clouds as they beat clothes against the stones, muttering about rheumatism and husbands who expected miracles for supper. The river steamed faintly in the cold, the only thing that looked alive that morning. Bess was in rare form. "You hear about the miller's wife?" she began before she'd even set down her basket. "Which one?" asked Alice. "The living one," said Bess. "Found her husband sleeping in the grain sacks again. Says he snores louder than the mill wheel." "That's not snoring," said Clara. "That's the sound of a man trying to hide from responsibility." The women howled, their laughter fogging the air. Once the laughter faded, the talk turned, as it always did, to money, or the lack of it. Someone's rent had gone up. Someone's son had lost another job. Someone's chicken had stopped laying out of what was assumed to be solidarity. Clara listened, scrubbing in rhythm, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She didn't speak much unless it was worth saying. That alone made the others curious. Silence among washerwomen was unnatural. "You're quiet, Clara," Bess said after a while. "Plotting something?" "Just deciding which of my problems to ignore first," she replied. "It's a long list and I like to pace myself." That earned another round of laughter. The women loved her for her bluntness. It made their own complaints feel smaller, almost fashionable. Between loads, the gossip deepened. They spoke of the butcher's daughter who'd run off with a tinker, the doctor's new assistant who'd been caught reading novels during work hours, and the mayor's cousin who claimed she was fainting for love, though everyone knew it was gin. Clara's comments came like little pebbles tossed into the flow of conversation. Dry, perfectly timed. "Love's a fine excuse," she said. "Cheaper than medicine and twice as dramatic." The women laughed again, though a few glanced toward the cottages beyond the field. Gossip was one thing, being overheard was another. As the morning wore on, the conversation turned more domestic, the kind of chatter that sounded ordinary but carried a sharp edge. "My Arthur brought home half a loaf from the tavern," said Alice. "Half," said the rest went to the boys. "At least he brought home something," said Bess. "Mine brought home a cold." Clara wrung out a sheet and said, "Mine once brought home a ferret. Thought it was a cat till it bit him. Honestly, I preferred the ferret." They bent double laughing. There was something sacred about that laughter. Not joyful exactly, but necessary. It made the ache in their backs feel lighter, the water a little warmer. They laughed about everything because not laughing was too close to crying, and crying made you useless for the rest of the day. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the chatter shifted to smaller grievances. Soap prices, fabric quality, whose daughter was courting whom, and whether the grocer's new apprentice looked respectable or just tall. Clara listened, tossing in the occasional remark like spice in stew. "Respectable and tall are rarely the same thing," she said. "True enough," said Bess. "And tall never lasts once they start stooping to look for work." By midday, the bank was alive with voices, arguments, laughter, scolding, songs half remembered. The sound carried down the water, rolling with the current like something alive. Even the passing men gave it a wide berth. There was power in the noise of women who weren't pretending to be polite. When the washing was nearly done, the women spread their damp laundry across the grass and stood with hands on hips, admiring the illusion of order. "You know," said Bess, "for all we do, you'd think someone would thank us now and then." "Oh, they do," said Clara. "They just do it silently in their heads right before they dirty the next batch." "Ungrateful lot," muttered Alice. Clara smiled. "If people stopped being ungrateful, we'd all be out of work." That made them laugh again. That tired, wonderful laugh that belonged only to women who'd spent their entire lives soaking other people's messes out of fabric and out of themselves. As they packed their baskets, Bess leaned close and whispered, "You know, for all the talk about you lately, Clara, you're not half as odd as people say." Clara grinned. "Give me time, Bess. It's early yet." The days shortened quickly after that, the mornings arriving grey and grudging. Frost rimed the stones where they knelt, and their hands went red and cracked before the first shirt was rinsed. "We'll have knuckles like walnuts by Christmas," said Alice, blowing on her fingers. Bess nodded. "At least walnuts are useful. My Arthur says he'll buy me gloves next pay, but I think he meant for himself." Clara dunked a sheet in the water and said, "If he does, borrow them often. They'll last longer when you wear them." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was warm enough to fog the air. Jokes were the only currency that never ran short. By late morning, the riverbank had become its usual parliament of grievances. The butcher's wife had been seen with the draper again. "Talking about fabric, if you can believe that," said Bess. And the grocer's boy had been caught weighing the apples with his thumb still on the scale. "He's practicing for marriage," Clara said. "All measurement, no fairness." They liked her sharpness. It was something to aim at. Clara never raised her voice, but her words always landed exactly where she meant them to. When she teased, it sounded like truth disguised as mischief, and everyone wanted to hear it. "You should come to the tavern sometime," said Bess. "The men could use your mouth for sharpening." "They already do," said Clara, wringing out a pillowcase. "Only they call it nagging." Another wave of laughter rose, echoing off the trees. Even Alice, who still crossed herself when someone cursed, laughed till she coughed. It was an odd comfort. No one here had much, but together they had noise, and noise was life. The gossip turned domestic again, whose children were growing too fast, whose weren't growing enough, whose husband had brought home new debts like souvenirs. The talk moved easily between sympathy and cruelty. One moment they'd bless someone's health, the next they'd question her morals. Clara never judged. She'd learned long ago that judging people was just gossip with better posture. Around noon, a small commotion broke out over a missing bar of soap. "I swear I put it right here," cried Alice, rummaging through her basket. Bess said, "You probably left it at home." "No," Alice insisted, "it was here. Someone's taken it." Clara lifted her own bar, sniffed it. "Not me," she said. "Mine smells of vinegar and regret." The laughter that followed turned the theft into a running joke. By next wash day, 2 more bars had gone missing, and they started calling their corner of the river the place where soap goes to heaven. Sometimes the talk turned softer. They spoke of old friends gone, babies lost, mothers buried with their best apron folded neatly on their chests. No one said much during those moments, but the quiet had a kind of weight to it, an agreement that everyone carried something they couldn't wash out. Then Bess would make a rude remark about her husband's feet, and the moment would rinse itself away. Clara seemed lighter through it all. She worked without hurry, joked without malice, and listened without judgment. When someone asked how she managed to stay so calm, she said, "Lower your expectations. Of life, of men, of soap quality. It's the secret to serenity." Bess laughed so hard she nearly dropped a shirt. "That should be stitched on a sampler." "It wouldn't sell," Clara said. "People prefer lies that rhyme." As the sun dipped low, the women wrung out the last of their linens and draped them over the grass to dry. The air smelled of wet wool and cheap starch. Bess sighed. "Another day's work and nothing to show for it." Clara shook her head. "Not nothing." The gossip alone could keep the town alive for a month. Alice grinned. "You should write it all down," Clara smiled. "Why spoil it with paper? Words should be like soap, used up by evening." The others laughed, and for a moment the chill didn't matter, nor the cracked hands, nor the long road home. They stood there together, surrounded by laundry fluttering like tired flags of survival, talking about nothing and everything. The sound of ordinary women keeping each other awake against the slow pull of the day. The cold came in properly the following week, the kind that stiffened fingers before the first sleeve was rinsed. They arrived at the river with skirts tucked high, voices already sharp with complaint. "It's too cold for decency," said Bess, kneeling onto her rag. "If my Arthur wants clean collars, he can boil them himself." "Careful," Clara said. "Say that too loud and he'll take you up on it, then blame you when he burns the water." Laughter bubbled through the chill. It always began like that. Complaints first, laughter second, gossip third. They didn't plan it. It was simply how the day arranged itself. The talk started small. Whose firewood was running low, whose hens had stopped laying, whose eldest had been seen walking with the butcher's boy, and not for the price of pork. They scrubbed as they spoke, sentences punctuated by the slap of wet linen against rock. The rhythm was hypnotic, a kind of gossip metronome. Alice sighed loudly. "My Arthur says I talk too much," Bess grinned, "and yet he lives to complain about it." "I told him," Alice said, "the day I stop talking he'll miss it." Clara rinsed a shirt and said, "No, he won't. He'll think he's gone deaf and blame the dog." The women's laughter echoed down the water. A passing fisherman tipped his hat in greeting and received a volley of jokes about men who only catch excuses. He quickened his pace. He'd learned better than to answer back. By midday, when their arms ached and the cold had crept up their sleeves, the gossip deepened. It always did. Work loosened tongues the way drink did for men. One story led to another, until someone forgot where truth ended and invention began. Today's stories were half confession, half entertainment. "My eldest's courting a man from 2 towns over," said Bess. "Says he's in trade." I asked what kind, and she said ambitious. "That's not a trade, that's a warning." Alice giggled. Mine says she'll never marry, says she wants her freedom. Freedom's just more chores without supervision, said Clara. She'll come around. They laughed again, but quieter this time. There was a truth hiding in the joke, one they all recognised but preferred to mock than admit. As the sun slid low, the conversation turned unexpectedly tender. Bess mentioned her mother, gone 5 winters now, and how she still folded the laundry the same way her mother had taught her. Old habits keep the ghost content, she said softly. Alice nodded. I still use my mother's recipe for starch. Never sets right, but I can't change it. Clara smiled faintly. My mother used to say a well-scrubbed sheet was proof you hadn't given up. By that measure, I'm practically a saint. The others chuckled, but gently. They worked a while in silence after that, the kind that isn't awkward but earned, the quiet of people who've said just enough. The river made its steady sound beside them, like a sigh that had learned patience. When the light began to fade, Bess straightened her back with a groan. If I die here, promise you'll use clean water before you wash me. I'll use the dirtiest, said Clara. Wouldn't want to spoil your reputation. Alice nearly dropped her brush, laughing. She'd haunt you for that. Let her, said Clara. At least she'd have company. They finished the last of their work by lamplight, each woman's face half in shadow. The talk grew softer, but no less quick. Tiny stories, fragments, shared to keep the dark at bay. Do you ever notice, said Bess, that we spend our lives washing what'll only get dirty again? Clara said, that's life for you. Endless stains, but at least the view's nice. Alice grinned. You should be a philosopher. Clara wrung out her final cloth. I already am. I just charge by the hour. Their laughter trailed up the bank and into the early night, weaving with the smell of soap and damp air. And for a while, standing there together, they could almost believe the world was fair enough, or at least funny enough, to keep doing this again tomorrow. The next wash day began with bad tempers and thin patience. The sky hung low and colourless, the kind of grey that made everyone irritable before breakfast. The ground was slick, the water colder than usual, and someone, everyone was sure it was someone else, had borrowed Bess's best scrubbing brush and returned it a little more bald than before. If I find out who did this, she said, waving the ragged thing in the air like a weapon, I'll use it on their face next, Alice tutted. It's only a brush, Bess. It's not only a brush, Bess snapped. It's the difference between decency and disgrace. Clara, crouched by the water, said dryly, If your husband can't tell the difference between the two, save your bristles. That earned a few smothered giggles, but Bess wasn't in a forgiving mood. You'll want to talk, Clara Merrin. Half your wash looks like it's already been through Judgment Day. The air went still. They'd teased Clara before, but never quite like that. She looked up, her expression calm but sharp enough to slice soap. You'll have to forgive me, she said. My standards died around the same time as my last day off. There was a pause, long enough for the river to make its usual uncaring sound. Then Alice burst into laughter, and the tension broke like thin ice. Even Bess cracked a smile. All right, she said, you win. But if anyone's ruined my brush, I hope they enjoy the curse that comes with it. What curse? Asked Alice. The one I just invented, said Bess. I'm adaptable. Once the tempers cooled, the talk began again, louder than ever, as if to drown out any leftover awkwardness. They complained about their hands, their husbands, and the way the butcher had started slicing meat so thin you could read a sermon through it. The conversation bounced from topic to topic, a rolling current of words as constant as the water beside them. Clara contributed in her usual understated way, tossing small remarks that made them laugh harder than they wanted to. When Alice moaned that her eldest was courting trouble, Clara said, Better trouble than boredom. At least trouble buys you flowers first. As the morning wore on, the rhythm returned. Scrub, rinse, gossip, laugh. It was a kind of communion, though none of them would have called it that. The work itself demanded silence, but silence was dangerous. It left too much room for thinking. Words, even petty ones, filled that space. They made the day bearable. If the world ignored them, at least the river listened. Near midday, the argument reignited over something trivial, whether boiled water cleaned better than cold. Bess swore by heat. Alice insisted it ruined the fabric. Clara said she preferred neither, as both reminded her of marriage. Too cold and nothing moves, too hot and it all falls apart. That did it. They laughed so hard they had to stop working, clutching their sides, tears mixing with river spray. Even the passing carter slowed his horse to stare at the commotion of women doubled over with laughter at something no man alive would ever understand. By afternoon, the wind picked up, scattering their stray soap wrappers and gossip alike. The argument forgotten, they drifted toward easier talk. Who was sick? Who'd left town? Who'd borrowed whose kettle? There were small kindnesses tucked into the chatter too. Someone shared a heel of bread, someone offered a needle, someone remembered a birthday no one had celebrated. In the middle of all that noise, they were soft with one another, not kind exactly, but familiar, which is often better. As the sun lowered, Bess eyed Clara across the water. "You're quiet again," she said. "I'm just listening," Clara replied. "To what?" "The sound of people not hating each other. It doesn't last long, best to enjoy it." Bess smirked. "You're a morbid one." "Just observant," Clara said, wringing out a shirt. "You can tell a lot about friendship by how quickly people start laughing after they almost bite each other's heads off." That made Bess laugh again, and with that the last of the bad feeling washed away. The women finished their work with the contentment that follows a good quarrel, tired, chatty, almost affectionate. When they gathered their baskets to leave, the air was lighter, the sky showing a hint of pale gold behind the clouds. "Same time next week?" asked Alice. "Of course," said Clara, "wouldn't miss it. This is cheaper than confession, and twice as honest." The women laughed as they went, their laughter chasing them up the path like small bright echoes, leaving behind only the scent of soap, wet wool, and the faint memory of women who'd argued their way into feeling alive again. The next wash day began with bad tempers and thin patience. The sky hung low and colourless, the kind of grey that made everyone irritable before breakfast. The ground was slick, the water colder than usual, and someone, everyone was sure it was someone else, had borrowed Bess's best scrubbing brush and returned it a little more bald than before. "If I find out who did this," she said, waving the ragged thing in the air like a weapon, "I'll use it on their face next," Alice tutted. "It's only a brush, Bess." "It's not only a brush," Bess snapped. "It's the difference between decency and disgrace." Clara, crouched by the water, said dryly, "If your husband can't tell the difference between the two, save your bristles." That earned a few smothered giggles, but Bess wasn't in a forgiving mood. "You're one to talk, Clara Merrin. Half your wash looks like it's already been through Judgment Day." The air went still. They'd teased Clara before, but never quite like that. She looked up, her expression calm but sharp enough to slice soap. "You'll have to forgive me," she said. "My standards died around the same time as my last day off." There was a pause, long enough for the river to make its usual uncaring sound. Then Alice burst into laughter and the tension broke like thin ice. Even Bess cracked a smile. "All right," she said, "you win. But if anyone's ruined my brush, I hope they enjoy the curse that comes with it." "What curse?" asked Alice. "The one I just invented," said Bess. "I'm adaptable." Once the tempers cooled, the talk began again, louder than ever, as if to drown out any leftover awkwardness. They complained about their hands, their husbands, and the way the butcher had started slicing meat so thin you could read a sermon through it. The conversation bounced from topic to topic, a rolling current of words as constant as the water beside them. Clara contributed in her usual understated way, tossing small remarks that made them laugh harder than they wanted to. When Alice moaned that her eldest was courting trouble, Clara said, "Better trouble than boredom. At least trouble buys you flowers first." As the morning wore on, the rhythm returned. Scrub, rinse, gossip, laugh. It was a kind of communion, though none of them would have called it that. The work itself demanded silence, but silence was dangerous. It left too much room for thinking. Words, even petty ones, filled that space. They made the day bearable. If the world ignored them, at least the river listened. Near midday, the argument reignited over something trivial, whether boiled water cleaned better than cold. Bess swore by heat. Alice insisted it ruined the fabric. Clara said she preferred neither, as both reminded her of marriage. Too cold and nothing moves, too hot and it all falls apart. That did it. They laughed so hard they had to stop working, clutching their sides, tears mixing with river spray. Even the passing carter slowed his horse to stare at the commotion of women doubled over with laughter at something no man alive would ever understand. By afternoon the wind picked up, scattering their stray soap wrappers and gossip alike. The argument forgotten, they drifted toward easier talk. Who was sick? Who'd left town? Who'd borrowed whose kettle? There were small kindnesses tucked into the chatter too. Someone shared a heel of bread, someone offered a needle, someone remembered a birthday no one had celebrated. In the middle of all that noise, they were soft with one another. Not kind exactly, but familiar, which is often better. As the sun lowered, Bess eyed Clara across the water. "You're quiet again," she said. "I'm just listening," Clara replied. "To what?" "The sound of people not hating each other. It doesn't last long, best to enjoy it." Bess smirked. "You're a morbid one." "Just observant," Clara said, wringing out a shirt. "You can tell a lot about friendship by how quickly people start laughing after they almost bite each other's heads off." That made Bess laugh again, and with that, the last of the bad feeling washed away. The women finished their work with the contentment that follows a good quarrel. Tired, chatty, almost affectionate. When they gathered their baskets to leave, the air was lighter, the ski showing a hint of pale gold behind the clouds. "Same time next week?" asked Alice. "Of course," said Clara. "Wouldn't miss it. This is cheaper than confession and twice as honest." The women laughed as they went, their laughter chasing them up the path like small bright echoes, leaving behind only the scent of soap, wet wool, and the faint memory of women who'd argued their way into feeling alive again. By the next wash day, the frost had sharpened into something meaner. The river ran thin and glassy along the edges, and every breath felt like biting into metal. The women still came, of course. They always did. No weather ever stopped laundry or gossip. Both had to be done, and preferably before midday. They arrived in their usual procession. Bess first, because she couldn't bear being late for anything. Alice next, humming half-heartedly, and Clara last, steady as always, her basket balanced against her hip like a small burden she'd long ago befriended. It started innocently enough. Bess leaned close to Alice as they unpacked their soaps. "You hear what I heard?" she whispered. Alice's eyes widened immediately, the sure sign she hadn't but wanted to. "What?" "About the new lodger at the carpenter's house." Alice's voice dropped to a hiss. "No." "What about him?" Bess smiled like a woman about to pour the first cup of tea after a long fast. "They say he's not a carpenter at all. They say he's running from something. A debt, a wife, maybe both." Alice gasped. "Who told you that?" "Someone reliable," said Bess, which in her language meant someone unreliable but entertaining. Clara, a few feet away, was half listening. She didn't join in until Alice said, "Well, if that's true, he shouldn't be renting from Mrs. Hargrave. She can't even tell her own age, let alone a liar's." Clara looked up from her scrubbing. "You think anyone's ever told their real age after 40? You're all living under false pretenses." They laughed, and the gossip rolled on, louder now, more colourful, less cautious. By mid-morning, the carpenter's lodger had been married twice, run from creditors in 3 counties, and possibly stolen a horse. By noon, the story included a duel, a lost inheritance, and a mysterious scar. By afternoon, no one remembered how it had started. The problem was gossip, like water, travels downhill. 2 days later, Mrs. Hargrave herself came storming down to the riverbank, shawl flapping, cheeks flushed with indignation. "Which one of you has been telling tales about my lodger?" she demanded. "He's a decent man, a quiet man. He's got a cough, not a criminal record." The washerwomen froze mid-scrub, their hands stilling on the stones. Alice stammered something about misunderstandings. Bess went pink to the ears. Clara alone looked up calmly. "I think you'll find," she said, "that gossip's like soap. No one admits to buying it, but everyone uses it." Mrs. Hargrave glared. "It's wicked, that's what it is." "Maybe," said Clara, "but wickedness keeps people awake. Better that than sleepwalking through life." The older woman huffed and left, muttering threats of prayer and public decency. The moment she was gone, the rest turned on Bess. "Honestly, Bess," said Alice, "you start enough rumours to run a newspaper." "Oh, don't act shocked," said Bess. "You were the one adding details about the horse." "I did no such thing." "You did," said Clara mildly. "But to be fair, it was a very good horse." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, as always, someone laughed first and the rest followed. It was impossible to stay angry for long among women who saw each other every week, who'd shared soap, sorrow, and worse. Still, there was an edge to the laughter that hadn't been there before. The sound of people remembering how easy it is to bruise each other when your hands are already cracked from cold. Later, as they packed up their laundry, Alice said quietly, "We shouldn't do it. Talk like that." Bess sighed. "Then what would we talk about?" "Our own lives," said Alice. "God forbid," muttered Bess, and they all laughed again, but no one said it wasn't true. Clara walked home that day a little behind the rest, her basket heavier than usual. The gossip hadn't touched her, not really, but she'd seen the way it spread, quick, eager, unstoppable. It reminded her too much of the river, always moving, always carrying pieces of people downstream, never giving them back. Still, she thought, if words were sins, at least they made the workday go faster. And perhaps that was the best any of them could claim, that they got through another morning laughing at everything that could ruin them and managing to make it sound like fun. The next week began quietly, which everyone agreed was suspicious. The river ran low and slow, the air heavy with that stillness that makes people fidget. Even Bess was subdued when she arrived. "I've nothing to talk about," she announced, which of course was a lie. When Bess claimed silence, it usually meant she was polishing a new story before revealing it. Alice eyed her warily. "You say that every time before you ruin someone's morning." "I'm learning restraint," said Bess. "It's exhausting." Clara smiled faintly. "Don't strain yourself. We'd hate for you to pull something virtuous." That earned a ripple of laughter, but it was gentler than usual. The last week's incident had left them careful, like people walking on ice. Still, the quiet didn't last. Gossip, like hunger, always returns. It began when Alice sighed and said she'd seen Mary Hewson, a woman from the next village, at the market buying meat on credit again. "Her husband's been out of work for months," Alice said. "She looked dreadful. I feel sorry for her." Bess made a noise that sounded like sympathy trying to remember its manners. "I heard it's not work he's short of, but sense. Drinks what little he earns." Clara didn't look up from her scrubbing. "Then they're in love, obviously. That's what marriage looks like after the poetry runs out." The women snorted, and the subject might have ended there, except Bess, perhaps out of habit, added, "Well, I only hope she doesn't end up like some people." Alice frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bess hesitated, then said too casually, "Oh, nothing. Only that Clara's husband spends his share at the tavern too, doesn't he?" The words landed hard and clumsy, like a stone tossed into shallow water. The noise stopped. Even the river seemed to hold its breath. Clara didn't react at first. She lifted a sheet, wrung it out slowly, the sound crisp in the still air. "He does," she said at last. "But unlike most men, he has the decency to do it somewhere I'm not." A few of the women tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. Bess looked immediately sorry. "I didn't mean—" "I know," said Clara. "You never do." Then she went back to work, her hands steady, her face unreadable. The silence that followed was a strange thing, heavier than argument, quieter than apology. They kept scrubbing, each woman pretending the sound of rushing water was enough conversation. The day dragged, the way guilt always does. When they finally stopped for lunch, no one mentioned it. They talked about bread, the weather, the price of soap, anything that didn't have a pulse. Even Bess, who could normally make a scandal out of a shadow, stayed subdued. She offered Clara half her sandwich. Clara took it without comment, which was her way of saying the world could continue turning. By afternoon, the tension began to loosen. Someone, it might have been Alice, made a joke about the mayor's new coat looking like it had been tailored by God in a hurry, and the laughter returned, hesitant but real. People can't stay quiet forever. It's against nature. Still, the mood lingered. Even as they worked, they stole glances at Clara, waiting to see if the crack would show. It didn't. She stayed as she always did, calm, deliberate, every movement exact. But her silence had changed shape, not brittle anymore, just deep. She was thinking, and that worried them more than any outburst could have. When the day ended, the women walked home together as usual, though they left more space between one another than normal. Bess tried to apologize again, but Clara only said, "It's fine. You needn't feel bad. It's our job, isn't it? To rinse out other people's messes and talk about them while we do it." "That's not fair," said Bess softly. "No," said Clara, "but it's true." They parted at the crossroads, each heading toward her own small patch of noise and worry. Behind them, the river kept running, carrying their words somewhere far downstream, where no one knew their names and no one cared who'd said what first. The next wash day dawned with a weak sun trying its best. The frost had thinned to dew, and the air smelled faintly of thawing mud and smoke from the town's chimneys. The women arrived in their usual order, baskets heavy, voices cautious. No one said anything about last week's awkwardness at first, but the silence felt like another person standing among them, arms crossed, waiting to be acknowledged. Bess broke it first, of course. "Morning, Clara," she said too brightly. "Morning," said Clara, not looking up. "Cold one," Bess added. "Could be colder," Clara replied. That was it. The apology, the acceptance, the whole negotiation reduced to weather. They both seemed relieved. Still, the others watched closely as they began to work, wondering if the friendship would hold. It did, though not perfectly. There was a thinness to it now, like fabric worn at the elbows. They joked as usual, laughed as usual, but something softer lay under the noise, a kind of gratitude that they were laughing at all. By mid-morning, the rhythm had returned. Hands dipping, cloth twisting, talk rising and falling like the current beside them. Alice, trying to lighten the mood, began recounting a story about the shoemaker's wife getting stuck in her own corset. She said she sneezed and couldn't breathe for an hour, Alice said. "Better an hour than a lifetime," said Clara, wringing out a shirt. At least she had an excuse. That earned a ripple of laughter, the kind that mends things more surely than apologies ever could. It wasn't long, though, before the conversation drifted back into more dangerous waters. Gossip has a way of sneaking into any gap left by comfort. Bess started it unintentionally. "Did you hear," she said, "about Mrs. Porter's daughter and the grocer's boy?" "No," said Alice eagerly. "What happened?" "Nothing yet," said Bess, "but give them time." That set them off again, a wave of speculation and teasing. Even Clara joined in, though her tone stayed mild. The grocer's boy, really? She could do worse, I suppose. She could marry him. The laughter that followed was genuine this time, loud, unguarded, echoing across the water. It felt like balance restored. They talked about everyone after that. The mayor's new housekeeper, the schoolteacher's haircut, the baker's mysterious rash. The gossip rolled freely again, not out of malice but momentum. It was their shared language, the background hum of their days. To stop speaking it would be like refusing to breathe. Later, while they were rinsing the last of the linens, Alice said thoughtfully, "You ever wonder what people say about us?" "Nothing worth hearing," said Clara. "If they did, someone would have told us by now." Bess smirked. "Oh, I don't know. I imagine they say we're hard-working, pious, and never talk about anyone." That broke them again. They laughed until their sides hurt, laughter bouncing off the stones like thrown pebbles. For a moment, even the river seemed to carry it kindly downstream. When they finally packed up, their faces were pink from cold and amusement both. "Same time next week?" asked Bess. "Unless the world ends," said Clara. Alice grinned. "If it does, we'll still meet here. I'm sure the apocalypse will have laundry." "Probably more of it," said Clara, "and worse stains." They walked home in small clusters, their voices fading into the thin afternoon light. The argument was gone, the bruised feelings rinsed away by talk and laughter. They would fight again, of course. They always did. But they would forgive again too, because forgiveness, for women like them, was less a virtue than a survival skill. The next week brought a surprise. When the women reached the river, a stranger was already there. Young, maybe 20 at most, with bright cheeks and a nervous way of holding her washtub, as if it might suddenly bite. She wore a dress too thin for the cold, and a bonnet that looked borrowed. The others exchanged glances as they approached. Newcomers were rare. No one joined the Riverbank circle unless life had already refused to let them elsewhere. Bess, who considered herself the unofficial forewoman of the group, cleared her throat. "You're early," she said, "meaning you're intruding." The young woman smiled uncertainly. "I didn't know there were hours." "There aren't," Bess said, "but we've got habits." Clara, kneeling beside her usual stone, looked up and said gently, "Don't mind her. She just likes to hear herself manage." That drew a few chuckles and eased the tension. The girl introduced herself as Maggie Reed. She'd come to town to work in the dressmaker's shop, but business was slow, and her employer had sent her to wash instead of sew. "Said it builds character," Maggie explained, wringing her hands. "Character's overrated," muttered Alice. "Tears your gloves and ruins your back." Bess softened a little. "You'll get used to it," she said. "We all did." Clara added, "Eventually you stop noticing how cold it is. Or you go numb. It's hard to tell the difference." They showed Maggie where the current ran best, how to wedge a stone to keep garments from floating away, how to beat the heavy cloth without splitting the seams. The work itself was simple enough. It was surviving the conversation that took skill. Maggie listened more than she spoke, her eyes darting between them, trying to keep up with the rhythm of jokes and jabs. By mid-morning the group had warmed to her. New people always gave them something fresh to talk about, and to talk to, which was rarer still. Maggie was curious, earnest, and too quick to blush. When Bess told her that gossip was a vital civic duty, she believed it for a full minute before Clara leaned over and said, "Don't worry, she's lying. It's just a hobby with delusions of grandeur." The laughter that followed carried far down the water, startling a few crows from the reeds. Maggie laughed too, though she wasn't sure why. She was grateful for it nonetheless. As the morning stretched on, the women did what they always did, turned work into conversation, and conversation into noise. Maggie's arrival gave them new topics. "So," said Alice, "you're a dressmaker, are you?" "Must be nice handling fabric that doesn't smell like life happened on it." Maggie smiled. "It's finer work, but harder in its own way. The ladies who buy the dresses complain more than the ones who dirty them." "That's true of most things," said Clara. "The cleanest people have the most complaints." The others laughed. Bess nodded approvingly. "You'll do fine here," she said to Maggie. "You've got the right sense of humour for misery." By midday they were all working easily side by side. Maggie, eager to belong, began asking questions about the town, who ran the bakery, who owned the mill, who not to trust. Each answer came with its own flourish of exaggeration. The butcher's wife was pleasant if you enjoy lectures about gravy, the grocer's boy harmless but dim as winter daylight, and the landlord a man who could charge rent for air if someone let him measure it. Maggie soaked it all in, eyes wide, laughter quick. But what began as friendly chatter slowly turned sharper. "You'll hear plenty about everyone soon enough," said Bess. "This town loves to talk." "They talk about us too, you know," added Alice. "What do they say?" Maggie asked innocently. Clara smiled. "That we're the reason the river stays clean," Bess smirked. "They don't mean it kindly." The women laughed again, but Maggie looked puzzled. "Why wouldn't they?" "Because," said Clara, rinsing a sheet, "people never like to think the ones doing the cleaning notice what's dirty." That quieted Maggie for a while. She worked without speaking, her reflection trembling beside hers in the current. When the others began singing, an old work tune turned into something half mocking, half soothing. She joined in softly, her voice high and unsure. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. By the time they packed up their laundry, Maggie was one of them, or near enough that it didn't matter. As they started home, Bess nudged Clara. "Well?" "What do you think of the new girl?" "She'll learn," said Clara. "Learn what?" "How to talk," Clara replied, "and how not to." By Maggie's third week at the river, she no longer flinched when cold water hit her wrists. She'd stopped bringing gloves, stopped apologising when she splashed someone, and had even started interrupting Bess mid-sentence. A sure sign she'd been accepted. She knew now that belonging wasn't granted all at once. It happened gradually, the way a stain fades, never disappearing, just blending in. The older women watched her with the indulgence of people remembering their own first mistakes. "You're settling in," said Bess one morning. "You've got that look about you, half tired, half resigned." Maggie smiled. "That's good, isn't it?" "It's realistic," said Clara, "and realism's the first step toward survival." The air that morning was crisp, the kind that made every sound sharper. The clatter of buckets, the slap of cloth, the rhythm of voices. Maggie had learned the rhythm too. When to ask questions, when to laugh, when to pretend she hadn't heard something scandalous. It was an art form, really, knowing which words to keep and which to let drift downstream. That day's gossip began with the usual complaints about husbands and bills, but soon turned to the dressmaker's shop where Maggie worked. "So, tell us," said Alice. "What's she like, your mistress?" "The famous Miss Bell?" Maggie hesitated, glancing toward Clara. "She's fine. Mostly. She likes things just so." "Meaning she's impossible," said Bess. "Go on." Maggie bit her lip. "She's particular. She once made me unpick an entire hem because the stitches weren't joyful enough." The women exploded with laughter. "Joyful stitches," cried Alice. "I suppose mine are downright suicidal then." Clara smiled faintly. "I've met Miss Bell. She could make sunshine feel inadequate." The laughter rolled for a while, carrying warmth into the chill air. Maggie laughed too, but she was still learning the difference between teasing and cruelty. How close they sat together, sharing the same stool. When she added shyly, "She wears so much perfume I can smell her before she enters," The others howled again, and something in her loosened. It felt good, being part of the noise. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't just the girl with the thin dress and careful hands. She was one of them. But gossip, like soap, foams up quickly and spreads faster than anyone intends. 2 days later, Miss Bell confronted Maggie in the shop, face tight with fury. "You think I don't hear what's said about me?" she hissed. "This is a small town, Miss Reed." Every word travels. Maggie stood frozen, needle trembling between her fingers. She wanted to explain, to say it had only been laughter, nothing serious. But laughter, she realised, is serious when it isn't shared. She muttered an apology, and Miss Bell waved it away like a bad smell. "Keep your chatter for the river," she said. "At least there, the dirt belongs." That afternoon Maggie returned to the river pale and quiet. The others noticed immediately. "What's the matter?" asked Bess. "Nothing," said Maggie. "Nothing always looks like something," said Clara. "Spit it out before it goes stale." Maggie hesitated, then told them about Miss Bell's anger. The story drew gasps, then indignation. "Well, that's rich," said Bess. "She thinks she's too good for a joke?" "She's probably made worse remarks about us." Alice nodded vigorously. "If people can't take being talked about, they shouldn't exist where other people have mouths." Clara said nothing for a while. She kept scrubbing, her hands steady, her eyes on the water. Finally she said, "The thing about gossip is it always sounds lighter when we're the ones saying it. But when it comes back it weighs twice as much." The others fell silent. Maggie swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to." "None of us do," said Clara. "That's why it never stops." For the rest of the day the chatter was softer, the laughter slower. Even Bess, who normally filled any silence within reach, seemed thoughtful. It wasn't guilt exactly, just the realisation that words, once loosed, don't always drift away. Sometimes they wait for you downstream. When the work was done, Maggie lingered behind with Clara, too shy to ask if she was angry. But Clara smiled faintly. "You're learning," she said. "That's good. Around here, gossip's not about malice. It's about breathing. Just remember to exhale gently." Maggie nodded. "Do you ever wish we didn't talk at all?" Clara looked out across the slow-moving water. "If we stopped talking," she said, "we'd start thinking. And that's much more dangerous." By the time the next wash day arrived, the talk had turned from neighbours to children, a subject that never ran dry. The weather had softened, the air smelling faintly of thawing earth, and the women seemed restless, as if the season itself had prodded them into complaint. Bess was the first to start, as always. "My youngest told me yesterday that he doesn't see the point in washing his neck," she announced, beating a shirt against the stone. "Says no one looks at it anyway. 10 years old and already an expert in filth and logic." Alice groaned. "At least yours talks," mine grunts. "I've got 3 boys and none of them can answer a question without using the word maybe." Clara smiled faintly. "You should be grateful. Maybe means they're still unsure whether to argue. Once they learn to be certain, that's when the trouble begins. That opened the floodgates. They spoke of every stubborn, wild and back-talking child in their households, as if reciting a litany of shared sins. "My Elsie told me yesterday that she'd rather marry a horse than a man who drinks," said Clara, wringing out a sheet. "And honestly, I told her she might be onto something. Horses are easier to feed and don't ask where their socks are." The women laughed so hard they had to pause their work. Bess wiped her eyes. "She's a bold one, that girl. I like her spirit." "So does she," said Clara dryly. "She's got enough of it to argue with the wallpaper if no one else is home." Maggie, who was listening closely, asked, "Were you like that when you were young?" Clara shook her head. "No, I was worse. But back then children didn't talk back, at least not in public. We just thought rebellious thoughts until they wore holes in our patience." Alice chuckled. "Now they say everything out loud. My daughter told me last week she'd rather be poor and free than comfortable and married. I told her that was fine, but she could start her freedom by paying for her own shoes." The laughter rippled through the group again, loud and tired and genuine. They joked because the alternative was despair, because motherhood was a job that never truly paid, only demanded. The river listened patiently, carrying the sound of complaint downstream like another load of laundry. When the laughter died down, the talk grew quieter, more honest. "It's the back talk that wears me down," said Bess. "When they were small, they just cried. You could hush crying, but words bite." Clara nodded. "They get it from us, you know. They hear us complain, tease, fight. Then one day they try it back and we call it disrespect. It's really just fluency." Alice looked surprised. "Fluency?" "Yes," said Clara. "They learn the language of survival. Same as we did." There was a pause then. Not silence exactly, but the quiet of women thinking the same thing at once. They were proud of their children, of course, but pride has a bitter edge when mixed with worry. Each woman could picture her own brood, half-grown and half-formed, testing the boundaries of patience at home, while she knelt here scrubbing the marks of everyone else's lives from cloth. After a while, Maggie spoke softly. "I used to think mothers just knew what to do." "My own made it look easy." Clara smiled. "That's the trick. We all make it look easy so the next fool thinks she's failing." That earned another laugh. Softer, weary, but full of understanding. The kind that warms even in cold air. The conversation drifted, as it always did, between seriousness and mischief. Bess told the story of her son trying to trade his school slate for a dead bird, claiming it was an investment. Alice confessed she'd once pretended to faint just to make her children stop arguing. Maggie admitted she didn't want any yet. "Not until I can keep a houseplant alive without shouting at it." Clara said, "That's wise. Start with something that doesn't answer back." By midday, the riverbank was alive again with laughter, half complaints and half confessions, their children, husbands and worries all blurred together in that endless necessary noise. They worked until the sun moved higher, and the ache in their shoulders reminded them they'd done something tangible, something that would at least look finished, if only for a day. When they finally packed up, Clara stretched her arms and said, "Children, husbands, laundry, all the same. You turn your back for a minute and they're dirty again." "Best not to turn your back then," said Bess. "Oh no," Clara said with a grin. "Turning your back is the only rest we ever get." The women laughed once more, the sound drifting over the slow water, weary, wicked and bright as soap bubbles in sunlight. When Clara came home from the river, she always carried the smell of soap and wet linen with her. Her husband once said he could tell what kind of day she'd had by the scent alone. If the air around her smelled of lavender, it had been a good day. If it smelled of lye and salt, he kept quiet. Tonight was somewhere in between. The air was thick with a clean tiredness, the kind that sits behind the eyes and under the ribs. Her eldest Peter met her at the door, barefoot and guilty-looking. "You're home," he said, which was never a statement of welcome. More like a weather report. "What broke?" Clara asked automatically. "Nothing," he said too quickly, and that was how she knew something had. Inside, the leg of the small kitchen table leaned precariously, tied together with what looked like a good twine. Clara sighed. "You couldn't use the bad twine?" "There isn't any bad twine," said Peter. "There will be next time," said Clara. Elsie was at the hearth, pretending to help with the baby, but really teaching her to make faces. "You're supposed to be minding your sister," Clara said. "I am," said Elsie proudly. "I've taught her to stick out her tongue when Peter talks." "Excellent," said Clara. "Another life skill. We'll add sarcasm next week." The baby gurgled, delighted with her new trick, and the sound softened Clara's annoyance. She set down her basket and knelt to wipe a smudge from the child's cheek. The room smelled of potatoes and soot, the scent of survival. Her husband was at the forge still or at the tavern. Either way, he was somewhere predictable. It hardly mattered which. "Did you eat?" she asked. Peter nodded. "Bread and broth." "Was it hot?" "It was once," said Elsie. "Good enough," said Clara. "We're not the kind of family that stands on ceremony." They sat together for a while in the soft, uneven light from the fire. Clara mended a shirt, Elsie hummed to the baby, and Peter tried to repair a toy horse with a nail far too large for it. The rhythm of it all, the small sounds, the clatter, the sighs, felt familiar if not peaceful. Families like theirs didn't get peace, just small gaps between complaints. After a while, Peter said, "Mum, why do you wash for other people?" "Because their dirt pays better than ours," said Clara. He frowned. "But it's never finished." "Nothing worth doing ever is," she said, then looked at him and added, "including raising you." Elsie giggled, and Peter rolled his eyes. "You always joke." Clara smiled faintly. "If I stopped, I'd start yelling, and that's louder." She didn't mean it cruelly. Humour was her way of keeping the edges soft, of making the endless work sound like choice. Later, after she'd tucked the children into the sagging bed they shared, she lingered by the doorway for a moment. The baby had one arm flung across Elsie's neck, and Peter had stolen most of the blanket again. They were all still except for the soft twitch of sleep. Watching them, she felt that mix of love and fatigue that mothers know too well, the ache that comes from giving more than you meant to, and finding somehow it wasn't enough. She sat by the fire, too tired to move, but not tired enough to stop thinking. Tomorrow would be the same, the river, the gossip, the scrubbing, the small jokes that kept her sane. She didn't resent it exactly. It was just the shape her life had taken. Like water, fitting whatever it was poured into. When her husband finally came in, smelling of ale and ash, she didn't look up. "There's food," she said. "Cold?" he asked. "It was once," she said. He didn't laugh, but she did, quietly to herself. Someone had to. The morning began with fog and aching joints. Clara walked the familiar path to the river with her basket balanced on her hip, the children's voices still ringing faintly behind her from the cottage. Peter had argued about boots, Elsie had refused to brush her hair, and the baby had decided that dawn was an excellent hour for chaos. "They're healthy," she'd muttered to herself. "That's the trouble." By the time she reached the water, she already felt as though she'd lived half the day. Bess was there first, thumping a rug against a stone like she meant to punish it. "Morning," she grunted. "If one of my boys lives to see adulthood, it'll be in spite of me." "Mine will live to spite me," said Clara, setting down her basket. "It's their calling." Alice looked up from her scrubbing and sighed. "My eldest told me yesterday she's not going to church anymore. Says she talks to God directly." Bess snorted. "And what did God say?" "Nothing yet," said Alice, "but I hope he tells her to wash her hands before dinner." The laughter that followed fogged the air. It was that kind of laughter women earn, one that hides exhaustion behind its teeth. They always began the same way, a chorus of small complaints, rising and falling like the water beside them. Maggie arrived late, apologising as usual, her hair half done and her skirt already damp. "My landlady's children wouldn't let me out the door," she said. "They've turned her house into a battlefield." Bess looked sympathetic. Children will do that. They're born generals, small, loud ones who refuse to retreat. Clara smiled faintly. "You'll see, Maggie. You start out thinking they're miracles and end up realising they're unionised." That earned another round of laughter, loud and tired but warm. The rhythm of the morning settled in. Scrub, rinse, gossip, sigh, repeat. Talk drifted between scolding and nostalgia. "They used to listen," said Bess. "Now they question everything. Yesterday my Sam asked me why people even get married. I told him it's so two people can share a kettle and the same disappointments." Clara said, "Mine asked if I loved his father. I told him yes, but not in a way he should try at home." Alice laughed so hard she splashed herself. "What did he say to that?" "He asked if love was supposed to snore," Clara said. "I told him only the cheap kind." For a while they worked in companionable noise, the river keeping time. Then Mackie said quietly, "Sometimes I think I'd rather have no children at all. The women at the shop make it sound like freedom." Bess shook her head. "Freedom's just loneliness that can afford furniture." Clara rinsed a sheet and said, "You'll change your mind one day. It's not the children that ruin you, it's how much you love them after they've done it." The others went quiet for a moment, letting the words settle. Then Alice said softly, "Well, at least they'll talk about us kindly once we're gone." "No," said Clara, smiling. "They'll talk about us accurately." The laughter came again, softer now but sweeter. The fog was lifting, and the sun threw thin ribbons of gold across the water. For all their complaining, the women looked content in their misery. The day would bring the same chores, the same arguments, the same ache in their backs. But for now they had each other, and the river, and the shared illusion that saying it out loud somehow made it lighter. By the time the baskets were empty, the talk had turned to supper plans and small mercies. "If my lot behave tonight," said Bess, "I'll bake something decent." "If mine behave," said Clara, "I'll faint. Then we'll eat whatever they burn while I'm out cold." They all laughed again, the sound carrying down the current, as if even the water knew that this noise, this honesty, was the truest thing they owned. Evening crept into the cottage the way damp does, quietly, through every crack. Clara came home smelling of river water and starch, her arms heavy from lifting and laughter both. The children were already quarrelling before she'd set her basket down. Peter and Elsie were arguing over a potato, each claiming it was the larger one. "It's the same size," Clara said without looking. "If you're going to fight over vegetables, at least pick something worth it." "But he started it," said Elsie. "I don't doubt it," said Clara, "but I expect you'll finish it." "You usually do." The baby, sensing noise was fashionable, joined in with an enthusiastic wail. Clara scooped her up and bounced her lightly. "There, there. I know, life's unfair and the soup's thin. We all suffer." The baby hiccuped and quieted, fascinated by the movement of her mother's mouth. "You see," Clara said, "even despair can be educational." She stirred the pot on the hearth with one hand while holding the child with the other. Dinner was a tired stew of yesterday's leftovers, and whatever the grocer had called cheap. Peter set the table, grumbling, and Elsie dragged her feet so dramatically you'd think the floor was uphill. "You'd think I was asking for a miracle," Clara said. "All I want is cooperation and silence, preferably in that order." When they sat to eat, the conversation began in the usual pattern. Peter complaining that the stew was watery, Elsie declaring she'd seen better meals at the neighbours', and the baby banging her spoon as percussion. "You're right," said Clara, tasting a spoonful. "It's dreadful. If anyone here wants to volunteer for kitchen duty tomorrow, I'll gladly retire." Peter blinked. "Really?" "Yes," said Clara. "You'll find the chopping knife right next to my patient's. Good luck locating either." Elsie giggled, and even Peter's frown softened. The baby threw her spoon, hitting the table leg, and Clara caught herself laughing too. She didn't mean to. It just slipped out, like air escaping a crack. The children looked surprised, then pleased, as though they'd won something. It struck her, not for the first time, that love had very little to do with softness. It was mostly endurance, dressed up as affection. After dinner, Peter tried to help by drying the dishes, which meant breaking one. Clara sighed, but said nothing, just set it aside with a resigned nod. "I suppose we'll call that progress," she said. "You can't break what's already chipped." Elsie pretended to sweep, but ended up humming to the baby, who squealed with delight. The sound was bright and absurdly innocent. For a moment, Clara stopped to listen. The day's aches eased a little, as if the noise itself scrubbed her clean. When the house finally quieted, she sat by the hearth mending one of Peter's shirts, the elbow worn through again. "You're growing too fast," she murmured to the empty room, "and I'm running out of thread." She could hear the children breathing in the next room, that uneven, comforting rhythm that made the cottage feel alive. Outside, the wind dragged over the roof, but she hardly noticed. Her world was measured now in small sounds: the tick of the kettle, the crack of wood, the faint creak of her own bones. Thomas came in later, smelling of smoke and ale, his face grey with fatigue. He paused in the doorway as if unsure whether to speak. "You're still up," he said. "Someone has to keep the furniture company," said Clara. He tried to smile. "Hard day?" "No harder than usual," she said. "But it's ending, and that counts for something." He nodded and sat, rubbing his temples. For a few minutes they were quiet, listening to the fire breathe. There was no tenderness between them tonight, but there was a kind of truce, the mutual exhaustion of two people who understood that love didn't have to be beautiful to be reliable. When she finally stood to bank the fire, Thomas said softly, "You're good with them, the children." Clara looked over her shoulder. "That's just practice. They're better at wearing me down than I am at resisting." He chuckled once, the sound rusty but real, and she smiled before blowing out the lamp. The cottage sank into darkness, and Clara stood there a moment longer listening, to the faint breathing of her children, to the slow quiet that follows long days, to her own heartbeat keeping its stubborn rhythm. Then she whispered, "Another day done," and lay down knowing tomorrow would sound exactly the same, and that she would manage it anyway. Morning came too soon, as it always did. The light slipped into the cottage with that guilty look dawn often wears when it knows it's arriving uninvited. Clara opened her eyes to the sound of the baby babbling and Peter arguing with Elsie over something that could not possibly matter. For a moment she stayed still, listening. The rhythm of family life was steady, relentless, like the river itself, only louder and stickier. She sat up slowly, feeling the kind of ache that comes from both age and repetition. It wasn't that she was old exactly, just thoroughly used. She dressed in silence, slipped on her boots, and stepped into the small kitchen, where the ashes in the hearth still held a whisper of warmth from the night before. She poured what was left of the tea, cold and bitter, but still tea, and took a slow sip. "Fuel for survival," she muttered to herself, "and possibly murder." By the time she reached the river, the day had fully yawned awake. The women were already there, sleeves rolled, skirts tucked, the familiar orchestra of chatter and complaint in full swing. Bess spotted her first. "You look better this morning," she called. "I haven't decided yet," said Clara. "Give me an hour." "Children all right?" "Alive," said Clara, "which is more than they deserve before breakfast." That set the tone for the morning, weary humour wrapped in frost and fog. The women laughed as they worked, tossing words back and forth like wet linen. Someone mentioned the price of flour, someone else the vicar's new sermon about gratitude, and someone, probably Bess, wondered aloud what gratitude tasted like because she was sure she'd never had any. Clara's hands moved automatically, her mind half listening, half wandering. The rhythm soothed her, the sound of water always did. When the gossip turned to children again, she felt herself slip back into the conversation. "Mine spent half the morning trying to convince me school was closed because the teacher had measles," said Alice. "Mine told me the same thing," said Bess. "They must have collaborated," Clara snorted. "I'd be impressed if they put that much teamwork into their chores." "You sound like my mother," said Maggie. "I sound like everyone's mother," said Clara. "That's how you know you've been promoted from youth to inconvenience." The laughter came easy this time, the kind that warms the air around it. There was something comforting about complaining in chorus. It made the burdens feel shared, as if every rinse and wring carried a little less weight because someone else was doing the same nearby. The women worked until their hands were red and the gossip had run thin, replaced by quieter talk, about food, about worry, about nothing at all. Clara found herself staring at the river again. It was moving lazily today, slow and thick with silt. She liked that about it, the honesty of it. The river never pretended to be pure, it just kept going. People could learn something from that. "You look thoughtful," said Bess, nudging her. "I was just thinking," said Clara. "The river's the only thing in this town that does its job without complaining." Bess laughed. "That's because it doesn't have children." "Or husbands," said Clara. "That's the trick. Stay single, stay serene." "You tried that once," said Bess. "I was 12, said Clara. "Yeah, didn't last long." The laughter rolled out again, carrying with it a bit of steam and fatigue. For a few seconds, the riverbank sounded almost joyful. The sun slipped through the clouds, pale and brief, painting everything in a light too soft to last. Clara didn't notice how beautiful it was until it was gone. But that was the way of things. Beauty always arrived mid-laughter and left before the joke was done. As the women packed up their baskets, the conversation drifted toward the rest of the day. Errands, meals, small complaints waiting at home. Bess grumbled about her eldest coming home late again. Alice sighed about her husband's endless talk of opportunity, which seemed to involve less work and more ale. Maggie, still young enough to hope, said she'd like to move somewhere bigger one day. Clara smiled. "Every place looks bigger when you're young. Then you get there and realise it's just another room that needs sweeping." They all laughed again, but quietly this time, the kind of laugh that sounds like understanding. Clara hoisted her basket and looked once more at the river before turning to go. The water was thick with sunlight now, gleaming and brown. It caught her reflection and broke it gently apart. "You and me both," she said softly, holding everything together with cracks. By the time Clara reached home, the house was already in full rebellion. Peter had decided to build a fort out of chairs, blankets, and one of her best petticoats. Elsie was conducting an experiment to see how long the baby could sit upright without falling over. 5 seconds, she cried as the child tipped sideways into a pile of laundry. Clara put down her basket and sighed. That's a new record. Congratulations to everyone involved. Peter popped his head out from under the blanket fort. "Mum, can we keep it up for supper?" "Of course," said Clara. "It'll make it easier to find you when I throw the potatoes." He laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't entirely sure she was. The cottage looked worse than usual, dishes stacked, a broom lying abandoned, and a faint smell of burnt, something still lingering from yesterday's attempt at toast. Clara began straightening things without thinking, her body moving the way it always did, half on memory, half on necessity. The children chattered around her like small, persistent ghosts. She caught fragments of their conversations. Peter arguing about dragons, Elsie trying to rhyme every sentence, the baby adding punctuation in the form of delighted shrieks. "Peter," she said, "did you feed the chickens this morning?" He froze. "I was going to." "That's a shame," she said. "They were counting on you." They've probably moved on by now, found a better boy somewhere who knows how to use his legs. "I'll do it now," he cried, rushing for the door. Clara smiled faintly. "You see," she murmured to Elsie, "guilt. The best motivation ever invented." Elsie was drawing shapes in the soot near the hearth. "Mum, why do you always sound tired?" she asked. "Because I'm awake," said Clara. "But you were awake yesterday too. And I've been regretting it ever since." Elsie giggled, and the sound softened the air between them. Clara sank into the nearest chair, lifting the baby into her lap. The child's hands were sticky with something. Jam, probably, or mischief. "You smell like survival," Clara told her, "and poor decision-making." For a little while she let herself simply sit. The cottage hummed quietly around her, the creak of the roof beams, the rattle of a loose shutter, the uneven symphony of her children's lives. It was chaos, but it was hers, and somehow that made it bearable. The river was behind her now, but she still felt it inside her, that same rhythm of movement and noise, of washing and starting again. When Thomas came in later, soot still on his collar, she was ladling soup into bowls. He sniffed the air suspiciously. "What's this?" "Dinner," she said. "Don't look so alarmed. It's edible." He tasted it cautiously, then nodded. "Not bad." "High praise," said Clara. I'll alert the parish." He grinned, tired but genuine, and sat with the children, who immediately began telling him every unnecessary detail of their day. Peter described his fort, Elsie demonstrated the baby's new wobbling trick, and Thomas listened with that absent patience men use when their stomachs are occupied. Clara sat back, watching them all, her face unreadable but her eyes faintly soft. The baby banged her spoon on the table, declaring some wordless victory. "She takes after you," Thomas said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm sorry." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was real, warm and crooked, the kind that turns fatigue into something almost tender. And for a few minutes, with the children chattering and the soup steaming and the house tilting slightly toward calm, Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, the day had been worth managing after all. The next day broke with a pale, stingy sun, the kind that promised warmth and then immediately withdrew it. By the time Clara reached the river, her breath was visible in small, irritated clouds. The women were already at work, their skirts hitched, their sleeves rolled, their words tumbling faster than the current. "Morning," called Bess. "You're late. We were about to start talking about you." "Carry on," said Clara. "I'd hate to interrupt accuracy." That earned the first round of laughter, sharp enough to echo. Clara dropped her basket beside the others and knelt at her usual spot, dipping her hands into the shock of cold water. She always liked the first sting of it. It felt honest, a reminder that she was awake and still functioning. The talk today had already found its theme, children as usual and the things they said that no one wanted to hear. "My oldest told me she's never getting married," said Alice. "Says she wants to travel." "Where to?" asked Bess. "Anywhere without her brothers, apparently." "I told my lot they could leave whenever they liked," said Clara, "as long as they took their laundry with them. None of them's been brave enough yet." The laughter came, tired, but easy. It was laughter for survival, an old reflex, a way to stretch sore muscles and sorer hearts. The women never needed to plan what to talk about. Life supplied enough nonsense daily to keep them busy. Bess complained about her son's new artistic temperament, which mostly involved refusing to work, and Maggie admitted she'd overheard her landlady's children practicing swear words behind the coal bin. Clara listened, wringing a shirt with mechanical precision. "I used to think I'd raise polite, sensible children," she said. "Then I realised polite children grow up to be polite adults, and those are the worst kind. I'll take noisy over obedient any day, at least noise means they're alive." Bess laughed so hard she dropped her brush. "You're a philosopher, Clara Merrin." "No," said Clara, "just tired in an interesting way." They worked in rhythm for a while, their hands busy, their words drifting between jokes and small truths. Maggie, still too young to be properly cynical, said softly, "It must be strange, having children who talk back." "It's worse when they stop," said Clara. "That's when you know you've lost them for real." The others fell quiet for a heartbeat, that rare kind of silence that feels like understanding. Then Bess, unwilling to let sentiment linger, said, "Well, mine never stop, so I suppose I'm blessed." "You're something," said Clara. "A blessed might not be the word." The laughter rolled again, bright and grateful. The river caught the sound and carried it away, as it always did. making space for the next confession, the next complaint. Clara felt her back ache, her fingers stiffen, her patience wobble, the usual sensations of being alive and responsible. And yet she smiled faintly. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was close enough to fool the day. When they finally paused to rest, Bess nudged her shoulder. "You ever wish for quiet?" "Sometimes," said Clara. "Then I remember what quiet sounds like. Bills, hunger, and thinking too much. I'll take the noise." Alice nodded. "Noise is proof we're still here." "Exactly," said Clara. "And until someone else volunteers to keep the world running, we may as well complain about it." They laughed again, all of them together, the sound bright and tired and beautiful in its own way. The river shone dully beneath them, and for a few moments no one spoke at all. There was nothing left to add. The work would go on, the gossip would return, the days would repeat, and somehow that was its own small mercy. By the end of the week the air had softened, though the women's tempers hadn't. The river ran fuller after a night of rain, carrying twigs, foam, and everyone's good intentions downstream. They gathered as always, baskets bumping against their hips, eyes tired but sharp. Work, after all, waited for no one, not even disillusionment. "Morning," said Bess, dropping her load with a groan. "I told Arthur I was staying home today, and he said, 'That's fine, you don't earn much there anyway.' So here I am, working harder than he's ever managed, purely out of spite." "Spite's a fine motivator," said Clara. "Lasts longer than love and doesn't snore." That earned a loud burst of laughter that echoed off the riverbank. Even Maggie, still young enough to think romance was a kind of salvation, couldn't help but grin. "You don't really mean that," she said. "Oh, I do," said Clara. "Love's pleasant enough in theory, but in practice it's mostly washing someone else's socks and pretending not to notice the holes." Alice shook her head, smiling. "You're hopeless." "No," said Clara, "I'm cured." They laughed again, that tired, forgiving laughter that always came easiest when someone else said the truth first. Then the talk began to wander, the way it always did, towards stories half remembered and emotions better disguised as jokes. Maggie asked if marriage ever made anyone happier. The silence that followed was long enough to count as an answer. Finally Bess said, "Happier? Number, but it makes you busier, and that's close enough most days." Alice added, "At least you've got company while you're disappointed." "Exactly," said Clara. "Loneliness shared is what they call companionship." Maggie looked between them, half shocked, half amused. "You all make it sound dreadful." "It isn't dreadful," said Clara. "It's just ordinary." "Dreadful's more exciting. Ordinary is what keeps you awake at night wondering if you're ungrateful or just observant." That quieted them for a moment. They worked in silence, the steady rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing filling the gaps that conversation couldn't. Then Bess, never one to sit too long with seriousness, said, "Well, at least our husbands don't talk much. Imagine being married to one who does." "Oh, I was," said Clara. "He used to have opinions about curtains." "And now?" "Now he has opinions about ale, which are cheaper and easier to ignore." The laughter broke the tension again, rolling up the riverbank like a small celebration of survival. There was relief in it. Not joy exactly, but the release that comes from recognizing that everyone's making the same compromises and pretending they're choices. When the laughter faded, Alice said softly, "Do you ever think about before, when you were younger, what you thought life would be?" Clara considered. "I used to think marriage was the start of something. Turns out it's more like maintenance work. Constant repairs, nothing glamorous." "That's bleak," said Bess. "It's practical," said Clara. "Bleakness just happens to be my most reliable tool." They chuckled again, and for a moment all the fatigue and regret in the air felt lighter, more manageable. Around them, the water moved steadily, unbothered by any of it. The river always seemed to listen, patient and amused, as though it had heard this same conversation 1,000 times before. By noon their work was nearly done, and the talk had softened into small, harmless chatter. What to cook, who was expecting, who'd been seen buying too much sugar at the shop. But the earlier honesty still lingered, the kind that sticks to the inside of a thought long after it's been spoken. They didn't say it aloud, but each woman knew it. Marriage didn't ruin them. It simply demanded more of them than anyone had warned it would. When they finally packed up their baskets, Bess said, "You know, for all our complaining, I don't think I'd trade it." Clara smiled faintly. "Of course not. We'd just complained somewhere else. They laughed one last time, low, tired, but real, and began the slow walk home. Behind them, the river murmured as always, carrying away the sound of their laughter and leaving only the quiet truth beneath it, that love and endurance were often the same thing, just scrubbed under different names. As the weeks rolled on, the days began to blend together. Washing, mending, feeding, laughing, surviving. Nothing changed, not really. But somehow that constancy became its own kind of peace. The women kept returning to the river, same hour, same stones, same stories told with new wrinkles each time. They complained and gossiped and laughed until the sound of it became a kind of hymn, one that only they could sing. Clara grew older by degrees, though she hardly noticed. The years wore her gently, the way water wears down stone. Patient, inevitable, leaving her edges smoother, her words quieter, her humour sharper where it mattered. She still joked about her husband, her children, the town. But there was warmth in it now, the soft understanding that everyone was just trying to stay afloat. Sometimes, when the others had gone and the river ran quiet, she lingered a while longer. She'd watch the last suds drift away and think about how everything, joy, worry, gossip, love, seemed to end up here eventually, carried off to somewhere she didn't need to name. The water never kept a thing, but it remembered how to keep moving, and that was enough. When she finally turned for home, basket lighter on her hip, she always glanced back once. The river never waved, but somehow it felt like it did. Like it understood her, and all women like her, who worked and laughed and endured without ceremony. Clara Merrin would never be known beyond her small town, but she'd been part of something larger. The sound of laughter over water, the rhythm of lives scrubbed clean and started again. And perhaps that was what mattered most. Not the grand things people chase, but the small, ordinary miracles that repeat quietly every single day.